Hey students, welcome to the lecture on race and racism. I was going to go back and re-record this lecture. It was the very first lecture that happened during the pandemic in the spring of 2020 when we were first kind of putting everything on Zoom. And I went back and watched the original lecture so I could update it. And then I realized I would say the exact same thing now that I would have said in 2020. So what's the frickin' point? So what I'm going to do is break it into three shorter pieces that you can watch and learn from, and then I'll kind of sum it up at the end. So the first part is about kind of the idea of the social construction of race and the idea of prejudice versus discrimination. So let's take a trip back to 2020, shall we? This is a new thing. Okay, so we're going to start the first one talking about race as a social construction. So what is race? Right? What is race? Well, race does not exist. There you go. That's the end of it. We've been talking about things like that are absolutes as social constructions. We should have a little sound effect every time I go ding ding. The concept of time and space and God. The notion that God is a white male, 65 years old. Social construction. The concept of beauty, how beauty varies as a social construction. Also, we've been talking a lot in this class about how gender is a social construction, about how gender varies from place to place and time to time. Well, we can also talk about race as a social construction, that race does not really exist. This is the truth about race. This is the truth about race. You look like your biological parents, your mama and your dada, and everything after that is made up. It's cultural production. There was an attempt to map the human gene. It was called the Human Genome Project. It finished the mapping of the human gene, what makes us human beings, in 2003. And one of the things they found is that the difference between so-called races, white, black, and other, is actually less than the difference within so-called races. There's more genetic diversity within white people or within black people or within Asian people. And it's really just nonsensical. If you've ever done one of those 23andMe, the chromosome.com or whatever it is where you send your spit in and they tell you about your background, you find that people are just all over the place. In fact, a study was done in the 1980s and found that 21% of people who called themselves white, 21%, 1 in 5, had an identifiable black ancestor, not from a million years ago, but from great grandma. And so, this notion that we're all sort of mutts, but 100 years ago, anthropologists tried to tell us that there were three races. There was the Caucasoid race, those of us who come from the Caucasus Mountains, I guess, the Negroid race, that would be the black Africans, and the Mongoloid race from Mongolia. That's the Asians. Sorry, Asians, you're the Mongoloids. I mean, it just sort of makes no sense because you know how many people don't fit into one of those three categories. And what about biracial people? What about people like my daughter, who is both indigenous Mexican and Caucasian? What race is she? I don't know. I ask her all the time. And so this notion that race was socially constructed, but it doesn't mean it's not really important to people. The construction of God is important to people. The construction of beauty is so important to people. The construction of time and space are very important to people. Just because it's a social construction doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But I wanted to give you an example of the ludicrousness of the social construction of race. When slavery ended in 1865, and we'll be talking a little bit about slavery, there was an attempt to be able to figure out who was white and who was black because there was a great fear of the mulatto. The mulatto was what we would now call a biracial person who somehow was passing as white but wasn't really white because they had a lot of black blood. So think Halle Berry, Barack Obama. I mean, all these people who are sort of biracial or black and white. That was sort of the great fear. So in the Jim Crow days, in the days when they were really trying to institute racial segregation as the law of the land, they came up with something called the one drop plus, or the one drop plus rule. It started in 1910 in Tennessee and then spread to a couple other states. But what this rule said is if you were 1/132nd black, 1/132nd, 1/32 black, you were legally black. And I sat down and tried to figure out what that would look like. like you've got 2 parents and 4 great grandparents and 8 great grandparents and 16 great great grandparents and 32 great 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 grandparents. I'll do a little, here's a little video or a little image. If all those, 31 of those great 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 grandparents were white and one of them was black, you were legally black, and that meant you couldn't vote, you couldn't, go into some businesses, you didn't have all these sort of opportunities that white people, and it just shows you how silly it is, that race is sort of this silly social construction, but it means a lot to people, including people who are defined as minorities versus majority. So the term race is social construction, and sociologists generally acknowledge that. Generally what we like to use instead of the term race is the term ethnicity. Ethnicity refers to a cultural group that comes from a similar culture. Remember, we talked about cultures, norms, and values, and all that stuff. And so to talk about the Irish as a cultural ethnicity, there is a certain race. I mean, having lived in Ireland for a while, you can sort of tell someone when they're Irish, that there are people who come from sort of cultural backgrounds, but often that can be many different racial characteristics. If you've ever been to Mexico City, let me tell you, Mexico City, amazing place. But we think of Mexicans as, if you're a white person, you probably have a particular image in your head of what a Mexican looks like. But you go to Mexico City, you see every shade. You see very European people, very dark-skinned indigenous people. You see Asian people, African people. All these people are all culturally Mexican, but they have different physical characteristics. So the term ethnicity is much more useful than the term race because it refers to the cultural background. So that's our rough definition of race, I guess. That it's a social construction. It doesn't exist, but it's meaningful to people. So that's point number 1. Done with that. All right, this is part 2 of the race lecture about prejudice versus discrimination. And this is kind of an interesting discussion that gets into the kind of complexity of some key ideas that we often kind of interchange, the idea of prejudice and discrimination. So let's define our terms. First of all, prejudice is an attitude. It's an attitude generally about a group of people. You can be prejudiced. You can be prejudiced towards Mexican food. I love Mexican food. You can be prejudiced against the New York Yankees. You can be, there are all kinds of prejudice. We're talking about prejudice as sort of a general attitude towards a group of people that is usually negative, even though you can have positive prejudices. I love the French. Vive la France. We're talking about sort of negative attitudes, but it's an attitude. It's different from a behavior. A discrimination is a behavior that disadvantages a group of people. So if you think about the classic Jim Crow discrimination based on race, you're not allowed to sit in this part of the bus, or you're not allowed to sit at this lunch counter, or you're not allowed to buy a house because you're this color skin, that type of discrimination. So we have sort of this general assumption that prejudice equals, that attitude equals behavior, that if you believe something, then you act on it, right? You talk the talk and you walk the walk. But one of the things that you learn is sometimes people have attitudes that they never ever act on, and some people sometimes act on attitudes that they don't actually have. And so this is an opportunity to figure out how that all plays out. And we know about this because a really famous study was done in the 1930s by this sociologist named Richard LaPierre. He was at Stanford, and he wanted to look at the kind of the intersection between prejudice, this attitude, and discrimination, this behavior. And in the first half of the 20th century, it's important to point out that there was a pretty strong wave of anti-Chinese sentiment in this country. After we imported a lot of Chinese labor, that labor was idle. We talked about how the laws against opium were often used to target Chinese laborers, and there was a lot of violence against the Chinese in the late 1800s and early 20th century, including in Eastern Oregon. There was something called the Chinese Cove Massacre, in which 34 miners who were Chinese were murdered and hacked to bits by white gold miners who thought they were cutting in on their territory. Portland had the largest Chinatown in the country after San Francisco, and one of the reasons Portland had such a large Chinatown is because the Chinese were being violently driven out of all the other Chinatowns on the West Coast, and there was sort of a safe haven in Portland, which is kind of cool about Portland. But it's just a time of a lot of anti-Chinese discrimination. Kind of feels like it's back at that moment if you've been to a Chinese restaurant in the last week. So what LaPierre wanted to do was find out how these things fit together. And so he was looking at the intersection of prejudice and discrimination. So this is going to be a fourfold table, and I'll flash this up here, but I'm going to pretend that I have a chalkboard. So remember our fourfold table, like that. And you have on the top, you would have prejudice. In this case, it is an anti-Chinese prejudice. So yes, you're prejudiced, or no, you're not prejudiced. Like that. Can you draw that? Hopefully that's not backwards. And then you have the discrimination on the side, the behavior. Yes. Hi. And no, you're not discriminating. Like that. Okay, that is like a really awesome fourfold table. And so what we would expect to see are sort of the box where you're prejudiced and you discriminate. That's kind of, what we would expect, this box right here. And this is what he called the pure bigot. And I'll do a screenshot of this when it's all done so you can kind of make sure you got it down. The pure bigot. Someone who has, in this case, negative attitudes and is discriminates against the Chinese. So let me explain how this experiment works before I went any farther. This is how he did this experiment. He wanted to see how many people would act on their anti-Chinese prejudice. So he had this great idea of this experiment, very simple. He called up restaurants and hotels and said, hey, I'm traveling with some friends of mine, and we want to see if we can get a seat at your restaurant, or if we can get a room at your hotel. And then some of them, he would say, oh, and by the way, my friends are Chinese. And some of the folks would say, yeah, we don't care. Just show up. We don't care. We're not prejudiced. We'll get you a room, or we'll get you a table. Some of the folks would say, no room at the inn. I've heard that before. Or, yeah, we can't take you. We don't serve Chinese people in our restaurant. I mean, they would get these prejudicial attitudes. And then the second part of the experiment, he would show up with his Chinese friends to say, hey, we want to get a room at this hotel, or we want to get a couple seats at this restaurant. And some of the places did what you would expect. The pure bigots, would say, hey, we said we don't seat Chinese, and what are you doing? We're not going to give any Chinese people a seat in our restaurant. Those are the pure bigots. Those are the folks that you would expect. But he also found a couple other weird things that happened that would play out in the fourfold table. So let's sort of fill this out. Knowing that this is this idea of LaPierre's 1934 study, that first of all, you have the pure bigots here. Those are the people who would say, we said we're not going to give a room to a Chinese couple, and we're not going to give a room to a Chinese couple. So they're both being prejudiced, and they are discriminating. And then there are the people down here who aren't prejudiced or aren't discriminating. Hey, we don't care. We love the Chinese, and sure, we're going to get you a room. The term that he used for that in 1934 was liberal. Now, liberal has a kind of a different connotation now than it did in 1934. And of course, there can be liberals who are racist, and there can be conservatives who aren't racist. So that liberal term has sort of fallen out. And I'm always, since we always learn language in opposites, I'm always thinking, why don't we have an opposite word for bigot? In our current language, we learn up, down, right, left, and we're always learning things in opposite, no matter what language you're learning. What is the antonym? What is the opposite word for bigot? Do I hear anything out there? Any suggestions? I mean, there really isn't anything. Liberal really doesn't fall out. So as a placeholder, until somebody can come up with a good word for the opposite of liberal, I'm going to use the word woke. That's a good Portland word, woke. But so these are bigots, and these are non-bigots. But then he found sort of these other categories. He found people who were prejudice, who would say, no Chinese allowed, but then when they showed up at the restaurant, they got a table, or when they showed up at the hotel, they got a room. So the people were prejudiced, but they weren't discriminating. So we had a good term for these folks. They were called the timid bigots. Timid bigots, meaning, they'll talk the talk, but they won't walk the walk. And I think you probably know some people like this. Some people will say some sort of racist things or some bigoted things, but they never actually act on it. They just like the sound of their own prejudice. So these are the timid bigots. And then this is even the more interesting ones. The people that weren't prejudiced, they would say, hey, Chinese are fine with me. But when they would show up at the restaurant or hotel, they wouldn't be served. There would be discrimination. So there would be no prejudice, but there would be discrimination. What do you think is going on there, class? That's right. Social pressure. There was some type of external pressure. Maybe the boss said, hey, if you serve these people who are Asian, it's going to cut into our, people coming to our restaurant because the bigots aren't going to come here and eat. Or the person might say, well, it's not me, it's my boss who's saying it. Somehow there's some other pressure. So we would call this the institutional bigot. Institutional, I'm writing it down, bigot. And this is an important one as well. So there's no prejudice, but there's discrimination. Think about our discussion about assets and housing and how many people of color did not get mortgage loans to buy houses, to start building equity in the American dream. Like, a lot of that was done by people who said, well, it's not me, but my boss is telling me, or I'm not allowed to do it. I might have mentioned that in 1919, the Portland Realty Board had a code of ethics, and it said if you're a realtor and you sell a house to a non-white family in a white neighborhood, we will kick you out of the realty board. So I could be the most woke realtor who wants to sell houses to whoever in whatever neighborhood, but if I'm being told I'm going to lose my job unless I discriminate, I'm probably going to discriminate. So this experiment from LaPierre in 1934 was really helpful in helping us to understand the complexity of what we would now call racism. We're going to define racism in a bit, but right there. And I'll do a little screenshot of it so you can you see it? I'll just do that. I don't have to edit it. You got it? Beautiful four. Not the last fourfold table we're going to do. So that is the quick version of prejudice and discrimination. All right. Boop. I hope you found that useful. That's the first part of the 3-part lecture on race and racism. I will tell you that there is almost always a question about the LaPierre study on the final exam. I'm not saying, I'm just saying. Hopefully you got that one down, that fourfold table. The fourfold table will haunt you for the rest of your life. Okay, in the next section we're going to talk about tools of prejudice and how the status quo, the racial status quo, is maintained, something that we're still wrestling with all these years later, from 2020 to now, even more so, I think. All right, so stay tuned for that section.